So we have been listening to the president there, taking some questions during his first face-to-face meeting with Iraqi Prime Minister. The president updating on the Strait of Hormuz, saying he is abandoning an idea that he floated to charge a toll for ships passing through the strait after speaking to different countries. Instead, he says some Mideast countries have expressed interest in investing in the United States. He added he doesn't believe anyone should be able to charge a fee for the strait, and he doesn't even like the concept. The president also responding he doesn't have regrets on initially lifting the naval blockade, saying he wanted to give Iran a chance to make a deal, but claiming Iran then started attacking again first. Want to bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez, who has been listening alongside us as well. A lot happening in the Oval, Gabe, so let's talk through some things there. I want to clarify some of what we heard from the president on the Strait of Hormuz, right? The president has said the Strait of Hormuz was, in fact, blockade was up. He was going to charge this 20% toll. Iran is saying the Strait of Hormuz is, in fact, closed. Walk us through the conversations that we know the president has had with these countries that he is claiming now is promising to invest in the United States versus pay that 20% toll that the president has said he begrudgingly, essentially, was saying the United States was going to charge.
Well, Yasmin, this is the rather abrupt backtracking here by the president of the United States around 24 hours after he had announced that idea, that 20% fee that he planned to charge those ships. Well, we just heard from the president right there saying that he spoke with several Gulf allies and that they preferred to go in a different direction. Now, Yasmin, this is reminiscent a bit of Operation Project Freedom, which was several months ago, in May, I believe, where the president had announced this idea where the U.S. military would help escort ships through the Strait of Hormuz. He received opposition from Gulf allies, and he backtracked about 48 hours after that had started. And again, now we see this backtracking, this about-face from the president when it comes to charging this fee. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and other top administration officials had repeatedly said prior to this that they did not think Iran should be able to charge any type of toll to cross through the Strait of Hormuz. So again, the president now trying to say that he was okay with changing up this plan because these Gulf allies, in his words, will invest massive amounts of money in the United States. But clearly, this is a significant shift that we frankly weren't expecting when the president announced it right before this meeting in the Oval Office, a bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister of Iraq.
And Gabe, I'm going to assume because this has happened really in the last 24 hours or so, we don't really have any hard details on promises made by any of these Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, some of the countries listed by the president after saying he spoke with them.
No, certainly. We're pressing the White House for any more details on this, on any investment deals that, they may have put forward as part of these conversations. But look, there was nothing stopping these countries from investing in the United States before this idea was announced. So this could be seen, as the president trying to spin a change. Perhaps he received some strong opposition from some of these Gulf allies. We don't know the specifics of those conversations just yet, and we expect to perhaps find out more details on this as over the coming days. Yes.
And do we know if any traffic is moving freely through the strait right now? Do we have any reporting on that?
As far as we know, traffic had been limited, but I'm not quite sure. The naval blockade was supposed to take effect at 4 p.m. This afternoon, according to the Pentagon. But the president, in his view, he says that oil is flowing freely through the Strait of Hormuz, but there are certainly a lot of concerns from shipping companies about insurance and whether it is safe to move through the Strait of Hormuz, given these ongoing hostilities, as you know, between the U.S. and Iran. Yes.
Yeah, I think we can both agree 1 + 1 is not equivaling 2 right now. If oil was moving freely through the strait, that means we would have traffic moving freely. So we need to get clarity on that. I want to talk about the Russia sanctions bill quickly, Gabe, if we can. This is something that the president has promised to get across the finish line on behalf of now deceased Senator Lindsey Graham. He is now also promising to add Hezbollah and Iran to this Russia sanctions bill. What more do we know on this?
Well, certainly this is something that, many Republicans on Capitol Hill are saying that the president should throw his weight behind in honor of Lindsey Graham. The president instead, in the wake of Lindsey Graham's death, had talked about or had called on members of Congress to pass a separate crypto-related bill that some critics of the administration said didn't really have a lot to do with Lindsey Graham. However, Lindsey Graham just returning from Kyiv in the hours before his his death over the weekend. Now the administration, is in talks with advancing this bill to punish those who buy sanctioned Russian oil. But there's still a question of whether that will move through Congress and just how much President Trump will throw his weight behind it in the coming days. Yes.
One last question you gave, and that is about Thursday. We know the president is going to be addressing the nation on Thursday. He was asked about that, sitting alongside the Iraqi prime minister, about what he's going to be talking about. He said, quote unquote, it's something incredibly important. He also said, without free and fair elections, we have nothing. What more do we know about this address?
Well, certainly, White House officials and the president himself, you just heard him there, he wouldn't specify exactly what he would be talking about, saying that he wanted to leave it till Thursday. The president, of course, teasing what he called a big announcement. But there has been some reporting out there, including from MS Now, citing two White House officials, that this will have to do with election integrity and the 2020 elections. The president referring to that, saying in his answer, seeming to confirm that it would involve election integrity, also saying that he would speak about other subjects. Now, NBC News, Yasmin, has reported previously, according to three sources, that the White House had designated a task force to begin combing and reviewing documents, thousands of documents from U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies to try and see any voting irregularities and any ballot box issues in the 2020 election. Now, we should point out there have been multiple lawsuits that have been filed by President Trump and his allies that were overturned by the courts, in large part due to a lack of evidence. And many election experts, including officials from the first Trump administration, had said that there was no widespread voter fraud in that election. Still, President Trump has continued to falsely claim that the 2020 election was stolen. But clearly, the president looking to pivot to that on Thursday and make some sort of an announcement. It appears related to that, although it does also come amid escalating tensions from Iran. So it remains to be seen exactly how many topics the president will hit in that address that he says is scheduled for 9 p.m. Eastern on Thursday night. Yes.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.